heart out of the city. But despite the great spirit that unified a nation, the nightly bombing raids also gave cover to a dramatic rise in crime. And none shocked the nation more than the murder of 4 women in 6 days. They'd been stripped naked and their bodies horribly mutilated. The hunt was on for the Blackout Ripper. Scotland Yard's foremost forensic detective was brought in to crack the case. Tony Britton takes up the story.
It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Everyone is anxious to get home before darkness falls, before our nightly visitors arrive.
If the police hadn't got to him, who knows how awful the toll might have been.
The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from the coast to London to pick up the drone of the German planes.
The total darkness turned him into a kind of werewolf.
Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night.
Word just spread like wildfire. Some still risked going out on the streets even though they'd heard there'd been these terrible murders and mutilations.
Now it's 8 o'clock.
Winter 1942. A dark shadow is cast over a devastated London. The Luftwaffe bombards the shattered skeleton of England's capital. Churchill's government is in crisis and Singapore is about to fall to the Japanese. These are times of fear and darkness. But in the cold despair of February, another evil stalks London streets. The long shadow of one of Britain's worst serial killers. His vicious attacks recalled the evil deeds of another murderer, a Victorian. This killer of 1942 was to become known as the Blackout Ripper.
The idea behind the blackout was to stop German bombers recognising where they were, and so all the lights and shutters and things, everything was put out, the street lights.
Central London was black, absolutely totally black. You really had to black out your windows so completely that the slightest crack couldn't be shown.
It was during these dark nights, and under the shadow of the bombing raids, that the killer first struck.
The first of the victims was a sort of respectable woman who in fact was dragged into an air raid shelter somewhere near Marylebone and strangled. There didn't seem to be any motive. She wasn't sexually assaulted, wasn't robbed.
The woman's body was identified by the police as Evelyn Hamilton, a pharmacist in her 40s. She had been strangled, and scattered around lay the contents of what was assumed to be her missing handbag. To many detectives on the scene there might appear to have been no leads. One man, however, was sharper than most, a rising star from Scotland Yard.
The great chap at the time was Fred Cheryl of the Yard, who solved any number of crimes because he was an incredible fingerprint expert.
Head of the fingerprint department, Chief Superintendent Cheryl was known throughout the force as the fingerprint man. Using his skills, he quickly deduced from the bruising on the victim's throat that the killer was left-handed. He recorded his thoughts on the case in his autobiography. What interested me most were marks on the victim's throat. In the dim light of the shelter, they appeared to have been made by the fingers of the murderer. From their position, I rapidly made another deduction and said to myself, this seems to have been a left-handed job. As the slaughter and the war continued, the murder at first received scant attention in the press. No one could have guessed there was a psychopath on the loose.
I think if you look at newspapers before and after the war, these would have been the headlines, but of course everything took second position to what was happening during the Battle of Britain and things like this. So there was a certain local interest, but also the newspapers were short of paper itself, so they were limited to what they could print, and most people were still interested in the war.
In fact, another body in the bloody carnage of war was hardly worth a headline.
Death was common in the big cities, in London and on the streets, so there wouldn't have been as much interest shown by people coming across a body as there would during peacetime. In nearly every street there would be friends or relations or friends of friends who would have been injured or died in a bombing raid, and so I think there was a live for the day attitude.
All this was about to change when the police found another body.
The second one was a woman who'd actually been on the stage, had become a prostitute, and who was found badly mutilated.
On arrival at number 153 Wardour Street, Soho, the police were confronted by a hideous and sickening crime. The body of former revue actress Evelyn Oatley lay naked on the bed. Having been brutally strangled, she had then had her throat cut, whilst the lower parts of her body had been savaged.
This man who killed by strangling, he actually mutilated the lower part of the woman.
Again, Cheryl was on the scene. It was only when one turned one's eyes to the bed that one realized the enormity of the crime which had been committed. Near the body of the dead woman lay a pair of curling tongs and a blood-stained tin opener. The latter was evidently the weapon with which the murderer had so wantonly mutilated his victim. It was here that Cheryl made another major discovery. Whilst examining the contents of the woman's handbag, he found a lady's hand mirror. After a minute examination of the room and its contents, I took possession of the tin opener and the piece of mirror. To me, these were very interesting exhibits, for upon that bit of looking-glass I detected what I knew to be a thumbprint. I soon ascertained that it had not been made by the dead woman, and I assumed it had been made by the murderer when he was turning out the handbag. From the fingerprints on this mirror and the murder implement used to mutilate the woman's body, Fred Cheryl again deduced the murderer was left-handed.
Fingerprinting had been around for a pretty long time by then, and it had first been realized that everybody has completely individual fingerprints in the 1890s. Of course, no two people have the same fingerprint. There's simply no possibility at all.
Fingerprinting was started being used in the courts in, I think it was 1908, and so they had quite a good database. It all depended if the person had committed a crime before.
But the fingerprints were not on any police file. It was evidence, but not a lead.
It's, of course, far more difficult if they've got no previous convictions, there's no fingerprints, there's no police information or intelligence about the person.
Disturbing similarities were beginning to come to light between this criminal and one from the Victorian age, the sexual predator and serial killer Jack the Ripper.
The only victim that Jack the Ripper killed inside, Mary Kelly, he did a sort of similar job. He really took her apart and threw pieces of her around the room.
We think of sexual predators as a modern phenomenon. I think we've probably always had it. Perhaps we didn't recognize the concept of serial killers, so they might have been treated as independent cases, and only the most outstanding ones would come to light as serial killing.
What you've actually got here is a pretty sick person.
And a serial killer was a particularly hard breed of killer to catch.
They're very, very difficult for the police to solve because there's usually a motive, but with these people murdering complete strangers, they're very, very difficult to solve.
Evelyn Oatley had lived apart from her husband for some time. It seemed probable she had turned to prostitution during the hardship of the war years. Being a prostitute in the Blackout could leave women exposed to the cruelest of predators.
At the start of the war, there was such a demand with soldiers and servicemen travelling the country that the supply started meeting the demands. There were more girls around, and when the Americans arrived, it was unbelievable. They were called affectionately Piccadilly Commandos and Hyde Park Rangers. And the difference was that the Rangers performed outdoors in the parks, and Piccadilly Commandos did it indoors.
I think there was more amateur activity as well because people thought that life was very temporary.
Very, very dangerous jobs, very dangerous.
So, despite the dangers, women continued to walk the streets at night, and it wasn't long before a third would fall victim to the Blackout Ripper. Join me in a few moments. Welcome back to Night Watch. As the Blitz raged nightly in London, the Blackout Ripper took to the streets looking for more victims. Close on his heels was Scotland Yard's ace detective, Fred Cherrell. But it took a third murder to confirm the Chief Superintendent's fears. He was hunting a serial killer.
The idea of a Ripper-like killer stalking the streets and preying on women began to look ever more likely as the police were once again called out. This time to an address in Gosfield Street, Marylebone.
The third murder, discovered 3 days later, when someone wandered about the milk outside the door and broke in, and they found this 42-year-old woman, Margaret Lowe, who was known as a prostitute, and found her body, once again with these mutilations.
Mrs. Lowe had been strangled with a pair of silk stockings, and her body had been hideously mutilated by an arsenal of weapons including knives and a candlestick. On the candlestick were fingerprints. At these, and the deduction that they were again made by a left-handed man, Fred Cherrell's mind leapt to a shattering conclusion. If this deduction proved correct, in view of the similarity in the mode of killing and the nature of the injuries inflicted, it appeared likely, in fact almost certain, that the two murders, those of Mrs. Oatley and Mrs. Lowe, were the work of one and the same left-handed man. It also struck me at this time that the same person might have strangled Miss Evelyn Hamilton, the victim of the air raid shelter crime, on whose throat I had detected the finger marks of a left hand. It dawned on the police that there was, without doubt, a serial killer on the loose. The news became public and panic spread through the Blackout's darkened streets.
Word just spread like wildfire, and it's a bit like the Yorkshire Ripper case. Most girls got off the streets, but there were still those who were willing to do business, and a few of them found to their cost it was the wrong thing to do.
Protection for women at that time would not have sort of been a major priority in the Blackout. I mean, it was really up to them to take care of themselves.
And once again, despite extra vigilance, the Blackout Ripper struck.
The fourth victim almost exacted the same kind of story. Found dead on the bed. This time she'd been mutilated with a razor. Obviously, whoever had done this was the kind of person who got completely carried away by violent sadism.
Hurrying to 187 Sussex Gardens off Edgware Road, Cherrell and the force were to come face to face with another example of murderous handiwork.
Once the serial killer type gets the taste of blood, as it were, you very often find that it becomes a habit. It's addictive.
This fourth victim was a slim blonde, Mrs. Doris Journet. She had been strangled with a pair of stockings and savagely butchered in a similar way to the two previous victims. A clock standing on a bedside table had stopped. It registered the time, 4:45. One glance was sufficient to tell me that the strangling Ripper had struck again. There was no doubt about it. He had left his signature to the atrocities, as surely as if he had written his name. Without a doubt, the police were now dealing with a particularly dangerous form of sexual predator, who enjoyed strangling women with stockings and then subsequently mutilating them.
I would imagine that there was something fetishistic about the idea of stockings, which were, of course, just coming into fashion at the time and very powerfully female identified.
He just picked up the closest thing to hand. He wasn't a man who carried a vast arsenal of weapons around with him. And he just seemed to go into a frenzy on the spot, and whatever he could see, whatever he could find, he picked up and started hacking around. I would guess that these mutilations were done in a frenzy rather than a cold-blooded manner.
And again, Cherrell and the police were drawing inevitable parallels between this killer and Jack the Ripper.
The very first murder, he suspected that from the marks of strangulation on the neck that the person was left-handed. And this was the case with Jack the Ripper as well. From the way that the bodies were cut, from one side to the other, they did experiments and which showed that it was likely that the suspect was left-handed, which narrows the suspects down tremendously.
It was clear to all that the Blackout Ripper was a savage psychopath on the loose. The police had little to go on. They knew he was a sexual sadist and was probably left-handed. All they could hope for was that a lucky break would give Fred Cherrill, the fingerprint man of Scotland Yard, the chance to make a conclusive identification. On the evening of Wednesday, February the 12th, 1942, a young woman called Greta Haywood headed out to Piccadilly Circus. Mrs. Lowe and Mrs. Doris Joannet had been murdered only hours earlier. Doris Joannet's body was still undiscovered. Whilst war was still the focal point in everyone's lives, the evenings were the time to enjoy yourself.
There was a live for the day attitude where people went out and, if they could, they just sought to have a good time.
Little did she know she was about to meet the Blackout Ripper, who had come out to Piccadilly Circus to have a good time too, though his intentions were far more deadly.
He went into central London with the idea of spending a night out. He'd already decided to pick up a prostitute when he went into London. He must have thought, my God, now I can do what I like. He was like a child given the run of a sweet shop. And so that when he got into Piccadilly, the notorious home of prostitutes, he must, in fact, have been absolutely tingling with sexual feeling from head to foot.
At some point in the evening, Greta Haywood met a Royal Air Force cadet who joined her for a drink. Everything was going fine until he made some lewd suggestions to her. She turned him down and left.
He couldn't stop himself. When women refused to go with him, he wouldn't take no for an answer. He followed them out.
Angered by her rejection, the man gave chase and pushed her roughly into a doorway.
A woman was dragged into a doorway by this chap who tried to pick her up. When she pushed him away, he said, well, give me a kiss anyway, and then strangled her unconscious. She succeeded in struggling enough to alert a passerby.
The Air Force cadet ran off, and the young woman survived. However, in his haste to get away, the mysterious assailant had left a vital clue: his gas mask.
He was interrupted and left his gas mask behind, and that's how he came unstuck.
Within minutes, police were called to the scene. But unperturbed and fired up by bloodlust, the man went hunting for another victim.
Promptly picked up another woman and went back to her room.
Together they headed back to her flat on Southwick Street near Paddington Station. Southwick Street was literally yards from where the undiscovered body of Doris Joannet lay, the Ripper's most recent victim. It was not until the next day, Thursday, February the 13th, that Doris Joannet's husband would return to find her dead. In this second woman's flat, the man struck yet again, attempting to strangle her. She fought and kicked to free herself from his strangling grip. She screamed, waking the entire household, and again the killer fled, this time leaving his belt belonging to his uniform, and she survived.
She, of course, like sort of most of the other women in London, was terrified of this new Jack the Ripper, and screamed and struggled like mad.
Now Cherrill of Scotland Yard at last had some hard evidence. The killer had left not only his gas mask, but most recently his belt. So, well within the space of 48 hours, the mysterious murderer had slain and mutilated 2 women and had attempted to murder another 2. He had gone straight from one crime to another, almost without pause. I still felt he was the man who had also killed Miss Hamilton. And now, thanks to 2 clues, the man was no longer a mystery. On the gas mask was his Air Force number, 525987. By checking this against RAF records, the police could at last identify the killer, a 28-year-old RAF officer cadet, Gordon Frederick Cummins.
When he was arrested, they discovered that he was stationed in the centre of London, fairly close to the Piccadilly area.
It was relatively easy to track Cummins down to his billet in North London and bring him in for questioning. Cummins was charged with the murders of Mrs. Oatley, Mrs. Lowe and Mrs. Doris Joannet, and with the attempted murder of the 2 women of that fateful night. At that time, there was insufficient evidence on which to charge Cummins with the air raid shelter murder of Miss Hamilton. although Fred Cherrill firmly believed that the Ripper was responsible for her death. At his billet, detectives found items belonging to the murdered women. When he was arrested, they also found in his possession a cigarette case previously belonging to Margaret Lowe. It looked like the Blackout Ripper had been caught. But who could be the human face behind these inhuman and brutal crimes?
He was the son of some sort of official who had had a fairly good education. His life had been a series of failures, extremely low achievement at school, sacked from various jobs subsequently for a rather frivolous attitude, and so on, until he really feels that he's an absolute nobody. And so the result was that around about 1935, by which time he's only in his early 20s, he decides to join the RAF simply because I think in those days the RAF symbolised something exciting, wings in the sky and all the rest of it.
Cummins' past history revealed little to suggest why this man should turn out to be one of Britain's most notorious serial killers.
It was strange that he did do these murders, because there's a lot of reason to believe that he had quite a lot of success with women, and he was known as the Duke, and he called himself the Right Honourable, and he was quite a hit with women, so it wasn't for sexual reasons.
Power and sex amount to very much the same thing in these instances of sexual sadists. They need to gain power over their women in order to do to them what gives them sexual pleasure.
He wasn't planning anything. He left fingerprints all over the place. And he didn't seem to care if he was caught or not. He just got his kicks through the act of mutilating women.
And revelations at Cummins' subsequent trial were equally surprising.
He was, in fact, married, and his wife sat patiently throughout the trial.
He would look up and smile across at his wife. He wasn't that worried about going to the gallows. He was just in another world in many ways.
The jury at the Old Bailey took just 35 minutes to find Cummins guilty. He was sentenced to death and was hanged on the 25th of June 1942 at Wandsworth Prison. He was still swinging from the gallows as an air raid alert was sounded. Some of the most conclusive evidence at the trial was to come from Fred Cherrill, Scotland Yard's fingerprint expert. When Cummins was brought up at Bow Street Police Court and formally charged, I took his fingerprints. As is usual on these occasions, he was asked to sign the fingerprint form. He made no demur and signed with his left hand.
It was a very, very good job that the police did catch him, though, because there's no doubt he would have carried on and on and on.
Well, truly gruesome murders. Our next killer was also keen on chopping up his victims, but he did so to conceal their identities and escape the gallows. Join me in a few minutes.